Okay, Jelle Feringa is currently writing his PhD thesis titled Design by Simulation. He's exploring the potential of simulation for architectural conception at the Hyperbody Research Group at TU Delft. Jelle has taught and lectured at IAAC at Paris Malaquais, ETH, TU Delft, and Aarhus School of Architecture. He's the founding partner in EasyCity Architecture and Design Research, together with Philippe Morel. The work of EasyCity is part of the permanent collection at the Pompidou Center in Paris, and also part of the Frac Orléans collection. In 2007, the office won the Sirius Cerusi Pavilion, and their projects have been exhibited all over the place, including Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, Archilab in Orléans, the Barbican Gallery in London, the Design Miami Basel in Miami, the Pompidou Center, the Maison Rouge, Architectural Association, and many more. Jelle's thesis focuses on the close coupling of advanced simulation methods with evolutionary computing methods. Early research results have been exhibited at the Transnatural in Amsterdam and also at the Club Transmediale exhibition in Berlin. At the Hyperbody Group, Jelle has been exploring novel CNC fabrication methods for the production of large volumetric elements by means of hot wire cutting. Currently, Jelle is working on setting up a robotics lab to further continue this angle of research. For his research work, Jelle relies on open source software. Working together with Thomas Paviot, Jelle has been driving the development of an open source CAD framework, Python, that I think that some of you know, CAD PLM development framework for the Python programming language. Anyway, I think that we will be amazed by some of the things that Jelle is actually working on. We will soon have a robot, a KUKA robot here at IAAC. Is actually arriving, I think, something like in 3 weeks. So I hope that we will be able to tempt you to come back and do something with us.
Oh, yes, please. Oh, so Marta, thanks for that second invitation, and thank you. Sorry. Do you have to be a bit closer? Sure, yeah, I can do that. So thank you for the warm welcome today, and Louise, thank you for showing me around the school, and thanks to the students for evocating your wonderful and interesting ideas today. I've been intrigued by the work of the IAAC and for a while now. I particularly remember the conference we had in spring, and a number of topics you touched upon. I hope to sort of factored into this lecture, which has been particularly inspiring. So many thanks for that. My lecture is titled "The Promotion of the Architectural Model," and it consists of 3 parts. So there's a more formal theoretical part. Then I'll introduce you to some of the projects, and I will finish by a projection, if you will. So perhaps some of you are familiar with Lewis Carroll endlessly unfurling saga Sylvie and Bruno. At some point, a quirky little man by the name of Mynheer regales the children with a story about life on his mysterious home planet. The story continues as follows. And then came the grandest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on the scale of a mile to the mile. Have you ever used it much? I inquired. It has never been spread out yet, said Mynheer. The farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So we now use the country itself as its own map, and I assure you it does nearly as well. So perhaps the grand map provides us an analogy of what is currently unfolding in architecture. That is, the model has lost its abstraction. Of course, we use the grand map on a daily basis. So I hope it sort of provides you an analogy of the current situation where architecture is moving towards. So this transgression of the model from a symbolic description to a Platonic original is making a dramatic impact on the practice, autonomy, economy, and economy of architecture. The digital model has been catalyst in expanding the scope of architectural form. Though little has been said on the dramatic epistemological shift of the model, so this lecture tries to index some of the origins and consequences of this loss of abstraction, which sort of the grand map is an indication of. So in this graph you see some of the aspects that I will try to introduce, divided in three domains: epistemology, the philosophy of science, if you will, robotics, and computation. In his article, Finite Nature, physicist Ed Fredkin states a radical, provoking idea. What cannot be programmed cannot be physics. If a process cannot be programmed on a particular universal computer despite having enough memory and time, then it can't be programmed on any computer. A computer is a universal device. If we can't program it on an ordinary computer, finite nature implies it can't be part of physics, because physics runs on a kind of computer. So I'm wondering whether there's an architectural analogy of this statement. However literal the interpretation, what cannot be programmed, cannot be built, might be, that statement is increasingly winning in relevance, given that both the conception and manufacturing of architecture increasingly runs on a kind of computer. The forefront of architecture has become a computational universe. Therefore, it's worthwhile to examine if Fredkin's theory of computing and physics can be interpreted in an architecturally meaningful manner. However true even the oversimplistic appropriation of Fredkin's theory might be, it doesn't do justice to its depth. So my understanding of Fredkin's notion relates to the transmutation of the architectural model. So what cannot be programmed, cannot be physics, constitutes a relation among the laws of physics an object is subjected to, the object's programming, if you will, and its physical manifestation. Therefore, if we can accept both architecture's computational turn and Fredkin's statement, the question surfaces whether Fredkin's notion can be subjected to this architectural interpretation. So here's an example. This is a bacterial portraiture. It's a slab seated with an engineered E. coli that was projected to an image of Charles Darwin. So bacteria in dark regions of the image express an enzyme which produces a black pigment. So the gene expression of the E. coli bacteria has been hacked, and this enzyme has been introduced, if you will. And this results in a positive print of the applied portraiture. So this is research by Jeff Tarber of Rice University. And I think this image illustrates this idea of finite nature. What cannot be programmed cannot be physics quite accurately. And what I'm fascinated with is that the constitution, the bacteria's formation or composition denotes its meaning. So meaning can be expressed by connotation. Let's say if you make a bird out of clay, the association to a bird is comes across by connotation, right? It reminds us of a bird. But let's say a real bird denotes the being of a real bird, right? It's literally what it is. And perhaps to a certain degree we see that also in this image. So in nature, and that's what this gene expression hack underscores, is that there's no interpretation here. Things are what they are. And why I think this is a relevant point is that for most architect, nature is something that provides an analogy, right? So, but from an epistemological point of view, this cold caricature of biomimicry can be sometimes somewhat perverse. So, I mean, if nature's mechanisms are that well understood, why do we settle for simile? Although there have been dramatic insights in how nature functions, many architects and even even contemporary computational architects operate no different than, for instance, Berlage, who was inspired by Haeckel's Kunstformen der Natur. So this is remarkable, since computing, since a contemporary understanding of nature is that computing is, if you will, nature's runtime, as a Fredkin statement. So my point is that if computation is conceptually so close to nature, why do we use it to mimic nature rather than become a part of it? So maybe I'm an extremist, I don't know. So the architectural model has become literal. With architecture's computational turn, the model changed in terms of both modality and denotation. The model has become the absolute project reference, where it used to be a declaration of architectural intent, merely a metaphor for the project to build. That is to say, the architectural model has been promoted. The transgression of the model from a symbolic description to a definition has made a dramatic impact on practice, autonomy, and economy of architecture. The first project where the promotion of the model became manifest is here in Barcelona. It's Gary's fish sculpture, fish folly. And what was remarkable about the project is that it was delivered a couple of weeks before the deadline, and if I remember correctly, it was built for around 90% of the budget, while the project itself is, as you see, it's a challenging build. However, what is certain is that the project is not a fish. So, although the model has become literal, its meaning remains figurative. It's a representation of a fish, and sometimes that can be, I think that can be quite a problem. So what the virtuosity of design to production's post-rationalization underscores is that this roof is not a straw hat, being the metaphor on which Shigeru Ban based his roof design up. So that wouldn't be an issue if it was built like that. Even it might be a legitimate position if the architect's design achieved a level of suspension of disbelief, in the sense that if we would have believed that it's a straw hat. So the roof was modeled in an oversimplistic way, and this image sort of demonstrates that a hexagonal pattern is projected from the ground plane and hence bears no relation regarding how the roof works structurally, for instance, which can be observed by the homogeneous thickness of the columns spread throughout the roof. You see, the wooden slats are as thick at the base of the column as they are at the rest of the rest of the roof. So it bears no relation to its structural load, for instance. What's striking is that, let's say, the rigor demonstrated in the project realization is, in my belief, in stark contrast with the precision in terms of its architectural conception. So where the model has become literal in fabrication, it remains allegorical in terms of its architectural conception. right? Here we see this projection of the hexagonal grid. So where the Centre Pompidou project struggles with, if you will, an analogical discrepancy, the recently completed Qatar National Convention Center of Isozaki deals with a functional discrepancy. So the shape of the building, or rather its structure, is the result of a topological optimization process with the objective of minimizing the volume required to distribute the loads on the roof. Now the irony here is that there's little load to distribute, although the base suggests a skyscraper. So the issue here is not the optimization process per se, but I would say rather its naive architectural application. So Marcos Novick, for instance, defines elegance as the achievement of maximum effect with minimal effort, as sort of an aesthetic appropriation of optimization, if you will. So from that point of view, this building is almost it's something of an obscene building, almost pornographic. So rather than that the optimization achieved a level of elegance, it produced a structure that overdosed on Viagra. Right? It's sort of an architectural impotence, if you will. So, you know, these projects suffer from this effect, right? It looks like a boat, but we can all agree that it isn't a boat. So, the model is dissolved in sort of the architectural modus operandi in the project of Fabio and Gramazio. The assembled bricks simultaneously are the architectural model as well as its architectural manifestation. So a representation of the robotic assembly process would be pretty meaningless, right? Therefore, if CNC-based building methodologies are to be embraced, so as the promotion of the model has to be internalized in the conception of architecture. So it's precisely this embedding of architectural knowledge that offers such that offers vast potential. And I'm really interested in this stage where, let's say, the architectural model becomes operative. So perhaps this project by Joris Laarman, although it's quite beautiful, it achieves the exact opposite, where the objective is trying to recreate a model. So you wonder what does all this complexity leads to? I think in the case of this table, it is a complicated table, not a complex table. So in a sense, you know, you could almost argue that Super Studio's simple table is conceptually more complex than the complicated table of Joris Laarman. So that makes you wonder, right? And as imposing and quite beautiful as I find this project, I find it also a little bit daft in the sense that the conceptual precision is again in contrast with, let's say, the rigor and precision in terms of manufacturing. So there's all this resolution of these particle elements, but let's say this is not a simulation, right? Or these balls would never propagate through space in this way. So it's a very ambivalent image, if you will. So what I find interesting in evolutionary computing is that it allows you to arrive at designs that are beyond your, certainly mine, intellectual capacity, right? So if you think of simulation, if you have let's say you have a simulation software on your computer, fine, right? A binary, and a lot of knowledge has been condensed in this software. So if you apply a model to this software, you can think of a simulation as latent knowledge, right? If I apply a model to this simulation model, I know more about it. So evolutionary computing is also a method that allows you to condense the latent knowledge of simulation into a model, right? So we start in a sense with is this running? Yep. So we start with a random population of chairs that are located in a, let's say, a design domain. And for each generation, there's a buildup of evolutionary pressure, right? So each chair has to be an improvement of the previous generation, otherwise it's not propagated to a next generation, right? So evolutionary pressure is being built up, if you will. But the interesting thing about this design approach is that it rids design of common assumptions and abstractions so commonly used in engineering. Yeah. So this is an overview of all the chairs we've come up with. It took about 6 weeks to compute all these chairs on the GRIP computing facilities of the INRIA. So, for instance, to evolve this chair, about 600,000 chairs give way to this finalized version. So we're also interested in, let's say, the computational potential of raw massive computational power. The other thing is that, and this is something I will try to elaborate on later in the lecture, is that to fabricate these chairs, it's not so difficult, right? It's just a bunch of contours that you cut by a water jet. So industrially, it's not such a challenge to produce difference, right? There's little industrial challenge in producing thousands and thousands of different chairs. So the question becomes, how do you create meaningful instantiations of a design concept, right? So this has been something an idea we've been trying to explore. So, for instance, this week there was this project on display at the university where I work in the TU Delft, and you know, students have been slaving over the assemblies of these Lego bricks, right? And to me it represents a pure contradiction, right? You cannot be a creationist believing in evolution, right? Either you believe in evolution or you believe in God. It's, you know, you have to you have to choose one side or the other side. It's like you cannot be a pro-life porn star, right? It would be a bit funky to do that. So I find it a little bit upsetting. It tries to be both creationist and evolutionary at the same time. And evolution, to me, is a mechanism, not a metaphor, right? So heavily upset. So this is let me try to introduce you to another project, that of the Cirrusy Pavilion. So Madame Cirrusy is a well-known art collector living at the former estate of André Bloch, perhaps familiar to you as the founder of Architecture d'Aujourd'hui. At his estate he built several of these habitacles. So those are sculpture for living with, not living in, if you will. The idea of the pavilion was to evolve a gallery such that throughout the whole year, throughout the whole day, The pavilion would be lit by approximately 200 lux daylight. So at some point, designing with light is one of the most banal things you could do, right? If a student comes to me, Jelle, I got a great idea, I'm going to design with light. You know, it's a terrible cliche. But let's say, if you master tools of simulation, you can kick in open doors, because you can approach the problem with a new level of precision. So John Mardelievich, who's an authority in terms of daylight simulation, built up a sky-sun model for me that is based on satellite climate data. So it's an incredibly accurate local model of the climate. It is also a cumulative model. So it's not, let's say, just one moment in the year. It's a model of a whole year. So this incredibly detailed model made it possible to evolve, to develop this concept, right? You cannot do this concept if you don't have an accurate simulation method. So what I find interesting in working with evolutionary computing is that it's sort of an amplifier of your architectural ID, right? For instance, Theo van Doesburg said that he was interested in the mere consequences of a simple ID. So the ID for this pavilion is brutally simple at some point, right? But evolution allows you to go to the mere consequences of this ID. I think in the end we won for a different reason, is that we shoved a lot of the program we shoved it underground, so that you access the site by ascension, and so you enter actually here in the lower right corner. So probably we didn't won by these fancy computational aspect, by good old-fashioned architectural thinking. So for instance, if you ask a classic engineer to do a lighting simulation, he will probably use the 9006 CIE standard, which is a hemisphere dome of 200 lux. So it doesn't matter if your project is in Rotterdam, Dubai, or on the North Pole. It's an incredibly coarse abstraction of the actual conditions. So what I'm sort of proud of in this project is, let's say, in contrast to the chair, which you can understand that was designed by a generative or computational process, is that sort of the method is really dissolved here in the architecture. So the method is sort of not evident in the resulting design, but in that sense a bit more subtle. That is a beautiful quote. This quote of John Holland: "Evolutionary computing is the mechanization of the scientific method." So, you know, as all architects experience, it turns out that our dedication was greater than that of our client, and we didn't get to build this pavilion. Pretty frustrating. So, I tried to think of a way to, let's say, sublimate the idea of the pavilion in something else. And of course I was sitting on all these tons of let's say solar positions, this very accurate model. So what I tried to think of is that whether I would be able to come up with an object that would cast a circular shadow throughout the whole year, throughout the whole day. So, you know, in architecture we're getting pretty used to complexity and or complicated things. So the question that I try to reflect on is that what really is complexity, right? Is it difficult, complicated geometry, or is it condensing knowledge into an apparently simple model? Okay, for you to decide what what works. So what's sort of fun about this project is that, you know, maybe it shares some of the aspects of the this work, the Mysterium Cosmographicum of Johannes Kepler. He thought he figured out a model to describe the universe, right? So by nesting Platonic solids, he thought he found a way to describe the architecture of the universe. And that made him a religious man, in the sense that if this is true, the universe is perfect, the universe is created by God, right? His mom was burned at the witch. Maybe this was also convincing. And so something interesting in the Stonehenge is that although it's a rationalist project, right? It's in a sense the contemporary interpretation is that it's a calendar, but it's both, let's say, a very rationalist and mystical project. There's this mystic aspect almost about it, and I'm quite fond of this duality, if you will. So it reminded me of these sentences on conceptual art by Solowit. Conceptual artists are mysticists rather than rationalists. They leap to conclusions that logic cannot reach. So a good example, maybe a far better example than the work I've been showing you, is this antenna that has been evolved by Greg Hornby of the NASA. So this is an antenna for a satellite. It consumes a lot of power, right? Because you'd like to still communicate with Earth and send signal to us. So, you know, since space is pretty much a vacuum, it doesn't take so much energy to drive forth, but communicating takes up a lot of power, and it's, you know, it's a pretty difficult thing to design as well, because, you know, after the iPhone 4, everybody knows that it's a highly multi-dimensional problem. You know, your GPRS has to work, your GPS, your UMTS, your normal GSM signal, all these different signals that are interfering like hell with each other have to have decent reception. So what I find so appealing about this antenna is that if you are not aware of all these complexities and all these subtleties, it looks like somebody channeled their anger on a paperclip, right? Though if you are well aware of what it really means, it represents the absolute state of the art in technology. It's a fun duality, no? So yeah, there was a pretty good update on this book cover by the of the mechanization takes command by Gideon. So I really love that they're able to change the cover from something purely mechanical to something that suggests the state of the art in computing. It's sort of fun. So to reiterate on this idea, right? This is the result of a petascale simulation, a 4 trillion cell metal annealing simulation. And what it makes me think about is that the person who wrote the code of this computational fluid dynamics solver, to what extent, how far did his mental image of the results of his algorithm, how accurate was his mental image of, let's say, the algorithms embedded in his solver, right? And I cannot imagine that you develop an understanding of these algorithms at this incredible detail, right? It takes months and months to compute at the what is it, at the Blue GNL supercomputer, which is probably, I think, the largest supercomputer in the world. So let's say computing generates knowledge. That's sort of what you can deduce from that. So there seems almost an alchemical component to evolution, or these simulation processes. It's a process of transmutation, of optimization. It allows you to achieve, results that lie beyond your intellectual capacity. It's a process of sublimation, of multiplication, of calcination, of conjunction. So the idea of alchemy is that nature drives nature drives toward perfection that bursts forth without the intervention of labor. What nature cannot perfect in a vast space of time, we can achieve in a short space of time by our art. That's essentially what you are doing in evolutionary computing, right? It's compressing the process of evolution. So this sounds really vague. Alchemy binds matter and spirit. I will try to precise that a little bit later on. Oh, double slide. Sorry about that. So this is a bridge evolved by Pablo Funes, who's a student of Jordan Pollack. And what's certain is that, this bridge, it tries to produce a Lego structure that goes as far from the table as capable, right? But what's striking is that, this lies beyond. It's again an example of something that lies beyond your own capacities, right? So the students of Jordan Pollack are Pablo Funes and the person I mentioned before, Greg Hornby of the satellite, are some of the most brilliant people in this in this field. So these images are images of the Golem project, and it really is a seminal project in the field of evolution. So remember, I was saying that alchemy binds body and spirit, and the Golem project really embraced that idea. So it simultaneously evolved, let's say, the body of a robot with the brain, right? So, and it's also something that biologists believe, in the sense that, let's say, if Marta and I would go to the hospital, yeah, and you would be so kind to, self-improvement, and I would get your head, it would take quite a while for, let's say, I wouldn't be able to move, probably, right? Because, let's say, our nervous system has been developed with our body, right? So there's the distinction between, let's say, between your how can I say that? Your spirit and your body is quite interrelated. So let me try to. There's something really disappointing about evolutionary computing, in the sense that it's a method for dealing with complexity, right? But the complexity that you can represent, the complexity that you can encode, is in fact very, very limited. So the chairs project that I showed you before is sort of what we've been sort of at the limits of what we were able to reach with traditional design encodings. So, are you familiar with the distinction of a genotype and a phenotype? Let's say your body is the phenotype of your DNA, which is a genotype, right? So the genotype is the encoding of you. of your being. So a problem in evolutionary computing is that the genotype is exactly equal to the phenotype, right? So here I have a binary matrix, and evolution is, if you will, reduced to bit flipping. Either I switch a voxel on or off, right? Though in nature things work very, very differently. So your brain is encoded by roughly 30,000 genes, and it results in 100 billion cells, right? So these encodings are incredibly, incredibly compact. So here again are these body-brain evolutions of Jordan Pollack. And again, these are the works of his students, Greg Hornby, Pablo Funes. So working together with Mark Schönauer, who's one of the leading researchers in the field of evolutionary computing, we have been able to do somewhat better encodings, right? So a voxel, in 2 dimensions, it scales quadratically, but in 3 dimensions it scales cubically, right? So you need a huge amount of elements to encode a design pretty precisely. So at some point you need so many elements, and since there's no abstraction, no modularity in this encoding, it just becomes pure noise, right? And the evolutionary process gets completely stuck. So the Voronoi encoding does it a little bit better, right? Since a cell can occupy a lot of volume or a tiny bit of it, right? So let's say during the evolutionary process, you can say that the encoding sort of is self-optimizing because it will distribute points in a reasonably effective manner. So it's not a solution, but it's a little bit better. So what is necessary to advance is to compile the genotypic code into a phenotype, right? So there has to be a sort of mapping aspect between the genotype and the phenotype. So it's not a one-to-one literal correspondence. No, it has to be interpreted, if you will. So there are a number of reasons why these design schemas don't scale well. So let's say the evolution is encoded in a very direct manner, and so it's not like a construction plan, right? A construction plan is a more indirect encoding. So there's no compactness, there's no bias, there's no modularity, there's no embedding of domain knowledge. So there are a couple of, let's say, aspects that are essential in order to make these encodings more scalable. So development is essential. So evolutionary computing is much modeled to a sort of 1950s understanding of evolutionary, and a lot has happened since that time. So when we come to the world, we still have to develop for about 30 years before you become somewhat useful to architecture, right? Or that certainly was the case for me. And another difficult point is that in evolution we only consider, let's say, fitness, how effective something is at a global level. So either my building works, my chair works or not. I don't say anything about an element of my building, right? So there's too little propagation of all this information in the evolutionary process. So there are a number of modes to overcome these limitations. So this is sort of a taxonomy of design representations by Greg Hornby. Maybe this is a little bit technical now to get into that, but there's one aspect I'd like to point out is that modularity, of course, but parameterization is not a generative encoding, right? And it's maybe interesting to quickly touch upon it because it's such a common misperception, right? People think that if they do parametric design that they are doing generative design. It's absolutely impossible, right? If you parameterize a triangle, you cannot go beyond the triangle, right? So let's say the generative capacity of your design is very, very limited. And this is also something that I find interesting about evolutionary computing, is that there's no bias, right? So you're not limiting the design process by your own assumptions. So let me speed up a little bit and skip these slides. So let's say the state of the art in evolutionary computing is inspired by synthetic biology, by molecular biology, by developmental approaches, by amorphous computing, and so this is a sort of classic design representation, right? We have a genotypic space, we map this to the phenotypic space, we compute its global fitness. So a more advanced way of doing this is from the genotypic space, let's say the DNA is being developed, right? It's exposed to an environment, if you will. And this environmental feedback is necessary to arrive at more scalable representations, if you will. So what's interesting about doing all this sort of research is that you get quite fresh perspectives on really obvious ideas at some point. So much to my resentment, actually you get back to this idea of morphogenesis, which is sort of a word really often misused in architecture, let's say, or used in a very metaphorical way. So what is morphogenesis? It's in terms of evolutionary computing, I think of it as many levels of indirection. So a plan upon a plan upon a plan upon a plan upon a plan. You can also think of morphogenesis as going from a local condition to a global condition, right? So my body consists of 10 to the power of 23 number of cells, like almost an infinity of cells. But let's say I am a global condition of very local interactions of these cells, right? So growth is something essential to develop scalable encodings. So what is... Oh, sorry, I'm moving a little bit too quick. So some of the elements in morphogenesis toolbox are growth, diffusion, reaction, cell signaling, intracellular communication, and cells can change their internal state. So you can change a cell from one type to another type. So for instance, topological optimization is always performed in a uniform, homogeneous material, right? You compute it in concrete or in steel or in wood or whatever. So, but let's say these sort of processes allow also, let's say, to design such construction in heterogeneous materials, right? Which would be far more creative, I think. So the models that I'm looking at and in my thesis are look a lot like this, right? So this is one of the shared obsessions of morphogenesis. It's called the French flag problem. So you try to evolve a French flag from really starting from a singular cell. The interesting thing is that hopefully I will be able to touch upon that later, but growth has lots of interesting capacities for architecture, right? For building, if you will. And something that I'm fascinating with is in these processes, right? These processes of growth, if you will, not in a metaphorical sense, but quite in a literal sense. What we are able to achieve is an idea that I'm trying to develop, which I call implicit fabrication, right? So all these wonderful robots, all these wonderful CNC tools that are at our disposal allow us to reach really high levels of complexity, right? But what is lacking in many of these projects is, let's say, a motivation. Why is it so complex, right? Does it has to be so very complex? Okay, let me try to develop that idea a bit later. So this is for instance, an encoding developed by Alexandre de Ver, with whom we've been working, that you can clearly see that it uses modularity in its encoding, right? So, for instance, at the bottom, you see here, the first snap operation calls the object brick. The second snap operation calls the outcome of the first snap operation. Can you see that in the structure? That you see these 4 elements, right? And then you see these 4 elements repeated. So all those elements are snapped together in a modular form, right? We see 4 groups of these elements that are snapped together. So rather than re-evolving those rules again and again and again, you are able to, let's say, condense this knowledge. So this is quite an interesting way of doing it. However, let's say, I think the way I see it, the most advanced encodings have been developed by Oryogev. So in a sense, you have a grammar, right? A number of operations that you can perform on a cell. It can split, it can grow anisotropically, it can rotate, it can move a little bit. A couple of simple operations, right? So words are forms of these operations. For instance, R1, repeat 1, Z can be a word boundary, C10I can cause a cell to grow isotropically by 10% based on the morphogen concentration that was measured in this cell. So from very simple operations, quite complex operations can be formed. And what's quite exciting about this is that there are also conditionals, right? So if a cell is sensing its environment, it can sense whether there's a lot of pressure coming, right? If there's really a lot of pressure from my neighboring cell on top, I should split in maybe in that direction or in that direction. But what's interesting about these rules is that they're almost human readable, right? So it condenses a form of knowledge. You see what I mean? If you can read this conditional form as, let's say, as an entity of knowledge, if you will. Maybe a bit optimistic idea. So an idea that I'm trying to formulate is the idea of implicit fabrication. And I must say I was really inspired by your lecture at the Fabricate conference. Let's say the work that you evoked at that Marta evoked at this conference. There was no distinction between design and fabrication. It's one and the same thing, and that is the direction architects have to develop. And the reason why is that, you know, Philip Johnson said that architects are a whore, and he was totally naive. The situation is much worse. You know, some of your colleagues are being encouraged by some tutors to enroll in competitions for which they are not paid, right? There are evenly I get all worked up. there are even less respectable architects among us that are even willing to pay to participate in a competition. So it's like getting a blowjob and asking the whore 50 euros, right? The situation is much, much worse than Johnson projected. So it's way better if you focus the work that you guys are doing here, and what Marta is putting forward here is a very responsible way of introducing, of teaching you architecture. Because by way of this, let's say, processes of implicit fabrication, you are able to take up a central role in the building process and not get exploited like some quack whore. So that's really impressive work by I mean it. So what is implicit fabrication? Sorry if I'm a little rude. I'm Dutch. It's in our genome. So this is Ariel Schlesinger's gas loop, and what I find evocative and what I think is part of this idea of implicit fabrication is that it's self-referential, right? You can ask yourself whether the tool has become part of the artifact, part of the artwork. You know, where does it stop being a tool? Where does it become a piece of art? You tell me, right? There's no distinction, right? So it's sort of symbolic for, let's say, the way I think we should develop architecture. So perhaps another example is this one-ton prop of Richard Serra. It's a self-referential structure. You can think of each of these components of this structure, of this assembly, as a tool that forms this assembly. It's self-referential in this sense. Is it a tool or is it an artifact? It's one and the same thing. And I think architecture is slowly creeping towards that understanding. So this lamp is, I hate Dutch design, but this one I find quite fun. Also because of this sort of self-referential nature, is this a tool? Is this the work of art, the design? So this is a knitting machine, right? Is it a knitting machine or is it a design object? It's really vague, and I'm quite interested in that. And let's say the reason why I'm interested in these images, let me try to explain that. In his thesis, Evolutionary Fabrication, the co-evolution of form and formation, John Riefel tries to evocate the idea of evolutionary fabrication. So evolutionary design has been used to automatically generate a wide variety of novel and creative objects such as circuits, robots, satellite antenna, and yet despite the availability of sophisticated rapid prototyping machines capable of printing objects out of plastic, metal, even circuitry, relatively few of these evolved designs have been physically manufactured in the real world. So John Riefel argues that the cause of this paucity of physical artifacts lies in the design first, build later philosophy in contemporary design. By only specifying the form of an object, this approach leaves unanswered the vital question of formation. As evolved forms become more complex, their formation becomes increasingly difficult for both humans and computers to discover. As a consequence, there is a growing fabrication gap between the complexity of objects which we can evolve and those which we can manufacture. The alternative proposed here is to use artificial ontogonies. It's a very poetic idea almost, no? Artificial orthogonals. A computational method inspired by the biological processes of growth in order to directly evolve the formation of objects. We introduce evolutionary fabrication, the direct evolution of assembly instructions within a simulated manufacturing system, and show that this approach is capable of injecting the novelty and creativity associated with evolutionary approaches into the realm of fabrication, generating not just novel objects, but novel means of assembling those objects just as well. So I'm not so coherent by myself. This is a quotation of John Riefel's PhD thesis. So that's quite an interesting idea, right? So then you see these images and you think like, what the hell? You know, it doesn't look as imposing as sort of this concept he's evoking, right? But you have to learn to read these images a bit. So let's say the gray areas in these assemblies are scaffolds. So they're temporary structures, right, that do not participate in the final artifact. So they're yeah, the fabrication is sort of implicit here. The objective of this evolution is to create as much shadow as possible, right? So that's not very sophisticated. It's just from the z-axis, right? Shadow. So if you look at the sequence just above my head, right? You can see that, in fact, this assembly is highly sophisticated, right? And it's exploiting the dynamics of very few components to arrive at a great shadow zoning, right? You see at the last image. So let's say the logic of assembly, the logic of fabrication is completely implicit into the evolutionary design. So let's say, this is quite a radical idea, I think. So on one hand, evolution allows you, let's say, to arrive at a motivated complexity, right? But I think the coming 5, maybe 10 years, hopefully we'll be able to work towards a form of evolutionary computing, and my thesis will be a very slim contribution to that, hopefully, to a design process where you arrived at this, not only at this, let's say, motivated complexity, for lack of a better word, but I was whining on and on and on about growth, right? And why is growth so interesting? Let's say if you want to assemble a, let's say, assemble a design by discrete elements the size of a, no, let me formulate it a little bit differently. Imagine that you'd like to assemble a column, right? Which would be boring if you don't have parsimony. So you have limited amount of bricks in sort of Gramaggio-Euler speed, a limited amount of bricks that you can use, right? So if we can consider your column optimal in terms of structure, you will need to do a lot of scaffolding, right? This structure will need to become porous, right? So why is growth so interesting, right? Because, let's say, this scaffolding is a logical consequence of the process of growth. So today I met two fun and really clever students who are working on this idea of us. You're working on the assembly of broken bricks, right? What was the name of the project again? I know it. Brick. Yeah. Again, please, louder. Ah, yeah, yeah. And why am I thinking about that? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But let's say, that's a little painful. So I was speaking about why growth is a necessary component to arrive, let's say, at complexity and sophistication in terms of assembly, right? So in growth, this this notion of scaffolding of these many temporary positions to arrive at a sort of motivated, porose, structurally optimized column, it's all there. It's implicit. I'm really fascinated and worked up about this idea. I want to work on it for another 10 years. So another aspect of implicit fabrication is perhaps this, right? So this process is something you're probably familiar with by now, right? So we write some script to generate some geometry, then we load our geometry in whatever Mastercam, whatever you use. So we use Mastercam to generate G-code, right? So this G-code is then interpreted by a controller. You know, it's a highly ineffective process, right? So if we look a bit to let's say more advanced industry like agriculture, we realize that a robot offers great potential in terms of fabrication. So the main reason, and guys, this is largely unexplored, is that a robot is Turing complete. It can send signals and it can receive signals and it can act upon those signals, right? It can sense its movement. If I'm exercising too much pressure, probably I should be doing something else, right? That's a robot can react. It's Turing complete. So an example of this is a harvesting robot, as you see depicted here, locating the fruits to be picked by computer vision. So how can this Turing completeness be exploited in fabrication? An example is that an assembly sequence can emerge by perception of markers in the assembly. So by assembling elements, a blueprint unfolds, laying out how to further develop the assembly, right? It generates further instructions. In biology, this mechanism has been coined stigmergy by the French biologist Grasset in '59, and it intended to mean the evocation of work by work, which is exactly what is going on, right? You assemble a couple of pieces, by computer vision you see new markers, work is evoked by work, and this concept is called stigmergy. The idea is that agents modify the environment, for instance by depositing, in the case of termites for instance, by depositing pheromones or building materials. Other agents encounter those environmental modifications and take other actions in response. Thus, stigmergy describes a way of storing information in the environment. It's a beautiful idea, no? And uses it as a means of indirect communication. So in fact, described like that, stigmergy resembles a Turing machine, such that in fact unfolding this assembly can be thought of the act of computing. So let's talk about self-assembly. Perhaps some of you are familiar by the, well, that was a little fast. Is it moving? Yeah, good. So Skylar Tibbetts, for instance, has been working on a number of interesting projects that apply the principles of self-assembly. And I think it's a very interesting direction to develop. In terms of fabrication, we are approaching the situation that the complexity of artifacts is no longer limited by the machinery or even the programming involved, but rather the limitations of material organization, assembly, and the capacities of the machine operator. Those become those horizons become within sight. Not just those tolerances, geometric complexity, and construction sequence are limiting factors in terms of complexity. So an interesting aspect of self-assembly is that rather than having an overview of the global assembly, of having the global building plan, only local information is required to continue the assembly. And remember how let's say the recent developments in evolutionary computing also underscore the importance of local information, right? You develop a set of local rules of a cell, much like a cellular automata in fact. And self-assembly also sort of overlaps there. So Skylar also developed a number of ideas on how to deal about error propagation, right? I mean, there will always be machining tolerances. So if you want to create an infinite line, he takes that as an example. You need to be able to correct those errors. So he has some TED Talks which are quite worthwhile. So remember remember this image of these artifacts that are growing, not in a metaphorical, in a literal sense. And perhaps we are able to find such a synthesis, right? We can deduce this assembly plan. This assembly plan has overlaps with self-assembly strategies, and the whole point of all this work is to arrive at the point of a motivated complexity, right? Where the complexity of the structure embeds a form of intelligence, a precision, as in, do you remember some of the older people in the audience, like me and Louise? Oh no, not Louise, sorry. I cannot say Martha, but sorry. But we remember Greg Lynn, for instance, right? Perhaps you younger guys don't. And he did, one of the best projects he did is this Alessi vase. And it's a gorgeous vase that was built out of titanium. Hot evaporated titanium was exploded in a mold bath, such that the material would be uniformly distributed to the mold, really like the highest state in manufacturing. And then it was anodized in a sort of gradient by slowly extracting. Beautiful piece. But what's wrong about it is that it's sort of this burlesque of biological form, and it's not made out of cellulose tissue, right? So it's pretty, yeah. I'm sort of worked up about it. So that's what I mean by motivated complexity, right? In nature, things are what they are. There is no interpretation, there is no connotation. So probably by now you think Jelle is a total fantast. So I'm trying to find some proof to to say that that's absolutely not true. Not in 10 years anymore, anyway, or 5. So this is sort of robotics in warehouses, right? Yeah, let me take a little pause. It's fun to watch now. Was that the same movie? Anyway, okay, you get it, right? So I know you're in a bit of a difficult situation economically, we too. But here's a fun thought. Let's say a blue-collar worker. Let's say costs 50, 60 euros an hour, whatever, right? An operational robot, all of the cost to run a robot per hour is roughly 5 euros. And it's, you know, it's decreasing rapidly, right? This is, you pay everybody, the robot implementers a big fee to run it, you buy new robots, so 5 euros an hour. and it runs 24/7, right? So you can have 12 robots running 1 hour for the same cost as sort of classic blue-collar worker. Maybe that's a little bit of a depressing thought, but perhaps it's, you know, it reminds me of the situation in the late 80s, early 90s, where they would say that we would live in a world, in a paperless world, right? And you all know that didn't happen, right? It only, paper uses only increased. So perhaps that's a frightening perspective for hardworking blue-collar workers amongst us. But perhaps I can offer a little bit of positive outlook. If all this amorphous computing works out, what it kills is management, right? So I'm more pessimistic for the bureaucratic management than for the blue-collar workers, if you will. So at some point I went shopping for robots, right? So this is the Opel factory that shut down in the beginning of the year. So I called up. You know, there's a couple of stages that the process goes through, right? So there's the first stages, the automotive industry visits, right? So evidently I call the guy and say, you know, I'm joining you to buy the factory. So it's sort of the closest thing I've ever been to a Blade Runner situation. So for instance, this welding tool, it's that big. It's beautiful. So let's say these are all robot controllers, right? So these are computers. And I really mean computer in the sense of a personal computer. It's completely Turing complete. Let's just say that if you're able to provide programming for all these robots controllers, then surely the last thing you need to worry about is the acquisition of these robots themselves. They are absolutely dirt cheap. So probably you heard this news of Foxconn replacing workers by 1 million robots in 3 years. So finally, I would like to end this lecture by introducing you to the work of Daniel Lobo, who's in fact I think he's either a researcher in Madrid or in Barcelona, I forgot, and Hot Lipson, who's also a student of Jordan Pollack. This work is called Reconfiguration Algorithms for Robotically Manipulated Structures. So what you see, for instance, in this structure here, is that it tries to evolve the structure to go up, right? To form a column or a tower, if you will. And it uses the idea of metabolism, right? Redistributing energy. But what I find quite fascinating is that it achieves this sort of synthesis between tool and artifact, right? So here you see a robot that is able to traverse through these tetrahedron structures, right? It's especially designed for that. So in fact, by those sort of forms of construction, a building effectively becomes a robot. Okay, that's it. Thank you. So I hope that some of these aspects here sort of are, well, maybe 2 or 3 of them have settled a little bit better in your brain. So thanks for your attention. And I don't know, do we have a couple of questions or discussion? You thought I was going to talk about hot wire fabrication, huh?
Well, I was hoping that because they are doing a meeting, you don't have to give me a
Yeah, I guess. Shit. I tried so hard, Marta. to be
Oh, good, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's say. Just a second. Let me dig up a bit of material here.
I think all of this, did it make sense? Did you catch things from time to time? I had the feeling that I was catching things from time to time. So it will give me a lot to think about your lecture. But in relation to you guys, maybe I can offer a little bit of explanation eventually. What you're doing at the moment in the digital fabrication class is basically you're designing something and you're sending it to a machine, right? But the machine is not thinking for you. The machine is not doing anything. There is no intelligence at the level of the fabrication. So all the intelligence is first. And once things are getting fabricated, there is nothing that you can learn from it. The moment that you begin to introduce sensors and introduce a kind of more intelligent, responsive machines, the machines are as important as what you had designed at the beginning, because they will begin to change it and they will begin to affect the design. So we will get into this on term 2 and term 3 for sure. So I guess that in some time you will remember Jelle's lecture and many things will come back to you.
Thanks. So these are some of the images of a project we've been doing about a year ago on hot wire cutting. So what sort of frustrated me in the traditional approaches of producing molds or elements is that milling is so incredibly dog slow. And you know, there's also, it's a bit useless to further develop it, because it will never work. In fully realizing the architectural potential, right? So if you think of, okay, let me try to be a bit more scientific about this. So if you think of a state-of-the-art facility such as Netcam in the Netherlands, you find milling machines that are able to scale up to architectural proportions. So let's think about how the speed of production of a hot wire machine compares to a large, really high-end, top-of-the-range milling facility. So material removal depth is, let's be very optimistic and use a huge drilling bit, right? So no precision whatsoever. That's the depth that it can go through is roughly 80 millimeters, right? So a normal, pretty big tooling radius would be 50 millimeter, right? Diameter of 3 centimeters. That's pretty coarse. So it moves about 10 meters a minute, right? You know, that mills away. What is this? Theoretically, it mills about 3/4 of a cubic meter an hour, right? But that's absolutely theoretical, because, of course, half of the time the machine is moving through air or repositioning, or right, or maybe you have to change the the object you're working on, change its orientation, or flip the boat, or so practically the material you're carving away is a third, maybe a third of a cubic meter an hour. It's really not that much, and only marginal improvements are to be expected, right? So the cost of the hot wired cells that we developed was a fifth of of milling the cells. And we used really not a state of the art of the machine, right? So the software for milling is unbelievably sophisticated, right? It's really, really high end. And for hot wire cutting, it's super, super primitive, right? So even with all those disadvantages with, let's say, a homegrown hot wire cutting machine with homegrown software, you still are able to be super competitive in terms of, you know, this milling facility that costs millions and millions of euros. And you know, a hot wire machine that yeah, you can engineer it yourself pretty easily, right? So these are specialized milling machines for the maritime industry. But let's say our super simple, ultra low-tech hot wire cutter, in terms of architecture, I think fulfills more potential, right? Because let's say if you cut through a block of material, you formed, you know, a cubic meter of, in a trivial sense, albeit, but you formed a block of material of maybe a cubic meter in 30 seconds or something. So let's say it's an incredibly simple way of manufacturing, but it's something that scales. And the other thing is that what I'm quite fond of with EPS is that it has pretty good potential as a building material, right? So it costs about 36 euros a cubic meter. Doesn't cost anything. And it has far better, let's say, isolation properties, insulation properties than concrete. And so, something that I'm working on now with Wes McGee and Dave Pegram is that we're doing a workshop in 2 weeks from now, and something an idea that we've developed. We share this sort of fascination of building with foam and robotic hot wire cutting. I wouldn't recommend you to build a custom machine for it. It's a bit pointless if you have a KUKA robot. No, why do that? But the interesting idea is that, let's say, you can really think about interesting processes of how you use, let's say, how you levitate from void to solid. So, for instance, if you think of half-timber structures, right? Are you familiar with half-timber structures? So you have a sort of a timber scaffold, and you throw some straw. What is it? Straw, and there's a clay. You fill in the holes with that, basically. And sort of, I'm quite keen in exploring these sort of half EPS structures, where part of the EPS is used as a scaffold for, let's say, for let's say, making these channels into which you can pour the concrete. Some of the EPS would be lost, and you would recycle it just to support the structure. Some of the EPS you would keep it into the structure, since it provides excellent insulation, right? So in a sense, those if you think of a classical half-timber structure, you have sort of the black, tarred wooden structures. Those would become concrete, if you will, and those sort of white structures would become EPS. It would be a pretty effective way of building. Yeah. Oh yeah. So here we're doing the tooling paths. Oh, another fun aspect about hot wire cutting is that, let's say, if you're doing these things by milling, and if you want to transport them to the building site, you have to again mill your packaging material, right? So it's slow, but it's also frustrating because you have to do more milling again. So this was sort of an unforeseen advantage, is that after you do your cutting, you just take off the block, dump it on your truck, you're good to go. So let's say this, there's really little waste in a sense in the whole process. And I mean, everybody in architecture loves this white on white stuff, right? It's just beautiful like that. So these are some more technical matters, right? But now, yeah, now it's old for me. I don't know. All right. Thanks for your attention.